That's not a figure of speech. That's what happened on the Kansas High Plains on the night of January 14th, 1875, when a blue norther came screaming down out of the Dakotas without a lick of warning and turned a mild January evening into a killing cold faster than any man or woman in Haskell County had ever seen in their lives. By midnight, it was sitting at -18 degrees Fahrenheit outside. By 2 in the morning, a family named Kowalczyk on the far side of the creek had burned their last stick of dry firewood, and the father was heading out into the dark with an axe to split fresh-cut logs that were frozen half through and wouldn't light for anything. 3 families ran out of usable fuel that night. 1 family didn't. She was 16 years old. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, and 7 months before that blizzard hit, a man named Clem Hauser had thrown her off his property with $11 and a single change of clothes and told her she was no longer his problem. What Clem Hauser didn't understand, what nobody in that county understood until the snow came, was that Nora Brandt had been paying very close attention to the ways things could go wrong. And she'd already thought of something that every experienced homesteader on the plains had overlooked. The Brandt family had come out of the hill country of Württemberg, Germany, in 1862, part of that great mid-century tide of German immigrants who looked at the American frontier and saw something worth crossing an ocean for. Nora's father, Heinrich Brandt, had been a woodcutter's apprentice as a boy, and he carried with him a particular kind of knowledge that didn't translate well onto the open grasslands, a knowledge of timber, of how wood breathed and dried and rotted, of the way moisture moved through stacked logs, the way water moved through soil. He died in the spring of 1873 from a ruptured appendix, 3 days before a doctor could have reached him from Dodge City. Nora was 14 years old when they buried him. Her mother, Greta, had married Clem Hauser 11 months later. Nobody blamed her. A widow alone on a Kansas quarter section with 2 children and 60 acres of half-broken sod wasn't a woman with many options. Clem Hauser had a going concern. 160 acres, a soddy that wasn't falling down, 4 head of cattle and a mule. He was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He simply had no use for a stepdaughter he hadn't asked for, and when Nora turned 16 in June of 1874 and it became clear she wasn't going to be either decorative or silent, he put the matter to her in plain terms one morning while Greta was out by the creek doing washing. He told her she had until the 1st of July. Nora spent the 2 weeks before she left doing 3 things. She memorized every piece of practical knowledge she'd watched her father use. She studied the way the established homesteaders around them had arranged their wood piles, and she figured out what they'd all gotten wrong. What she'd found a quarter-mile north of the Hauser property was a small parcel of unbroken land, 80 acres of tallgrass prairie that sat against a low limestone shelf to the north and had a seasonal creek running through its eastern edge. It hadn't been claimed because the creek was unreliable. It ran strong in March and April, thin by August, and dry by October most years. But Nora wasn't planning to farm it, not in any serious way. Not yet. What she needed was a place where she could build something that would keep her alive through her first winter, and this parcel had 2 things she valued above most others: the limestone shelf, which would give her building stone, and a small grove of cottonwood and elm along the creek that had been standing long enough to produce some genuinely large timber. She filed on it under the Homestead Act on July 2, 1874. The land agent in Spearville, a thin man named Ira Dobbins with ink-stained fingers, looked at her for a long moment and asked if her father was outside. She told him her father was dead and her mother was remarried and she was the head of her own household. He checked the language of the 1862 Act twice. Then he stamped the paperwork and handed it across the desk without another word. She was, as far as anyone in Haskell County knew, the youngest woman to file a homestead claim in that county's short history. She had $11 and a jackknife and a bone-handled hatchet her father had left her. And she started to build. Now, before we go any further, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know that what we do here is preserve the practical wisdom of the frontier, the skills and observations and hard-won knowledge that kept ordinary people alive in extraordinary circumstances. Stories like Nora Brandt's don't get told in history books. They get whispered down through families and then lost when the families scatter. If that matters to you, and I think it does, or you wouldn't be here, take a moment right now and hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories, and we'll be right back with Nora and the problem nobody else on that prairie had thought to solve. The first thing any settler building a cabin on the Kansas plains in 1874 had to decide was what to build it out of. The classic answer was sod, the thick, dense, root-bound grassland turf that could be cut into blocks with a breaking plow and stacked like bricks. A sod house was cheap, reasonably warm in winter, and could be put up fast. It was also wet, prone to collapse in sustained rain, dark as a cave, and given to hosting every variety of insect the prairie had to offer. Nora had grown up in a soddy. She understood its virtues, and she was not going to spend her life in another one if she could help it. The limestone shelf behind her property changed her calculation entirely. Kansas limestone, the pale, buff-colored sedimentary rock that ran in long, flat shelves through the Flint Hills and into the high plains, breaks naturally into slabs roughly 4 to 8 inches thick and 3 to 18 inches wide. It doesn't need to be dressed or shaped the way granite or sandstone does. You can pull pieces off a shelf with a crowbar and stack them in courses the same afternoon. Nora's father had told her once about the dry stone walls of Württemberg, about how his grandfather had built barns without mortar that were still standing after 100 years, and about how the secret was not the stone but the arrangement, the way each course had to bridge the joints of the one below it, the way the wall had to taper slightly inward as it rose to keep its center of gravity low. She spent the first 3 weeks of July doing nothing but quarrying stone. She'd rise before dawn, walk the 200 yards to the limestone shelf, and work until the heat became dangerous, usually by 10 in the morning in late July, when the temperature on the open plains would hit 98 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air came off the grass in visible waves. She'd go back to her campsite by the creek, sleep for 2 hours in the shade, work again from 3 in the afternoon until dark. By the end of the month, she had enough stone quarried for walls. By the second week of August, working with a technique she'd partly inherited and partly invented, tamping wet clay between the courses of stone for a rough mortar that dried rock-hard in the Kansas sun, she had 4 walls standing, 14 feet by 16 feet on the interior, with walls 22 inches thick. That thickness wasn't an accident. She'd asked herself, the way her father had taught her to think about any problem, what the wall was actually supposed to do. It wasn't just supposed to keep wind out. It was supposed to hold temperature. A wall that was 22 inches thick, even without a true mortar, would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. That's what the old German farmhouses did. That's what the cliff dwellings in the Southwest did. She didn't know this yet, didn't have the comparative reference, but she'd arrived at the same principle by plain reasoning. Thick walls don't just block cold, they store warmth. Walt Tressler rode past on a Monday morning in mid-August and stopped to watch her for a while. Walt Tressler was 47 years old and had been homesteading in western Kansas since 1869, which in that country made him practically a pioneer elder. He had a square, sun-darkened face and hands that looked like they'd been made out of old harness leather, and he was not a man who thought poorly of women's work. His wife, Dorothea, had done fully half the building of their own place and probably the harder half. But he looked at the walls Nora was raising, and he shook his head slowly. "Stone's heavy," he said. He wasn't being dismissive. He was making a practical observation. You get a hard freeze, the ground heaves. Heave bad enough, your walls crack through. Sod moves with the ground, stone don't. Nora told him she'd set the footings down 3 feet into the earth, below the frost line, with the largest flat stones she could find as a base course. Tressler considered that. "Below frost lines 27, 28 inches here most years," he said. "You go down 36, you're safe on that part. But your roof, you got no timber up there worth speaking of, and the cottonwood logs you've been cutting won't span 16 feet without a center post." He was right about that. She knew he was right. She said so. She told him she was planning a center ridgepole supported by a single interior post, and she was going to fill the spaces between her roof logs with sod cut from the north side of the creek where it was still holding moisture. "That'll hold," Tressler admitted. "Heavy, though. You get a wet spring snow up there, 3-4 inches of it, you're talking 400 pounds on that ridgepole. I'm cutting the ridgepole from the big elm on the east bend," she said. "It's 14 inches through." Tressler looked at her for another moment. He didn't offer to help. He wasn't being unkind. He had his own harvest to worry about, his own family, his own endless list of things that needed doing before winter. But when he rode away, she thought she saw the set of his shoulders change just slightly, as if something he'd assumed he knew had been revised. Harriet Voss came 2 weeks after Tressler in early September. Harriet was 52, the widow of a man who died of cholera in the summer of 1871, and she'd since run her own operation, 120 acres, with nothing but her own labor and the occasional help of a hired boy she couldn't afford to keep on past October each year. She was not a woman who wasted words. She walked around Nora's half-finished cabin 3 times, looking at the walls from every angle. Then she said, "Your door faces south?" Nora said it did. "Smart," Harriet said. "I put mine west, first place. Wind comes from the north and the west here. North more often, west harder. You put your door south, your back wall is toward the worst of it." "That was the plan," Nora said. "How many cords of wood you figure to cut?" This was where the conversation changed, though neither of them knew it yet. Nora told her, 6 cords. Harriet shook her head at that. Most families on the plains ran through 8 to 10 cords in a hard winter, burning constantly just to keep a soddy livable. 6 cords in a structure with no proven insulation, no stove, just the small cast-iron box stove Nora had managed to buy secondhand from a family passing through on their way back east, seemed like it wasn't enough. "You'll freeze," Harriet said. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was trying to tell a 16-year-old girl the truth before winter made the point for her. "I won't need to run the stove as hard," Nora said. "The walls hold heat." "Stone loses heat faster than sod," Harriet said. "That's a known fact. Dry stone, maybe," Nora said. "But I've got clay in the joints and I'm going to lime wash the interior. The outside I'm leaving bare so it'll absorb sun during the day. The inside stays warm longer than you'd think." Harriet looked at her for a long time. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite approval. It was the look of a woman trying to calculate whether the girl in front of her was genuinely smart or just young enough not to know what she didn't know. "What about your wood?" she finally said. 6 cords. I'll grant you the math if your walls hold. But where are you keeping it?" And that's when Nora showed her. Most homesteaders on the Kansas plains stacked their firewood the way everyone had always stacked firewood, outdoors against the wall of the house or in a separate pile somewhere accessible, with maybe a canvas tarp thrown over the top if they had one. This was how it had always been done. It was how Nora's father had done it, how every family in the county did it. And every winter, without fail, the problem presented itself. The top layers of the pile stayed reasonable if you kept a tarp on them, but the bottom 2 or 3 courses of wood rested on bare ground, and when the snow came and melted and came again, and when the spring rain started, the bottom wood got wet and stayed wet. Wet wood burned poorly. It produced smoke more than heat. It was twice as hard to split in cold weather. And if it froze after getting wet, it could become almost impossible to light at all. Every homesteader on the plains knew this problem. Every one of them had lost mornings and afternoons to trying to coax damp wood into burning. None of them had solved it in any systematic way, because there was always something more urgent to do, always another problem pressing. Nora had thought about this for a long time. Her father, the woodcutter's apprentice from Württemberg, had told her stories about the wood barns of the Black Forest, dedicated structures built just for timber storage, with raised floors that kept wood off the damp earth, with narrow ventilation slots in the walls that let air circulate without letting rain in. She didn't have the material to build a separate barn. She had exactly what she had. But she had something the Black Forest woodcutters hadn't had. A 22-inch thick limestone wall on the north side of her cabin that she hadn't touched yet. She dug a lean-to addition off the north wall, 6 feet deep and running the full 16-foot length of the cabin. The back wall was the limestone of the cabin itself, solid, dry, almost impermeable. She built the lean-to's outer wall from a single course of limestone blocks 3 courses high, about 30 inches, with no mortar and deliberate gaps between certain stones, 4 inches wide, 6 inches tall, spaced every 18 inches. These gaps let air in at a controlled rate without letting in direct rain or snow, because the outer wall stood 2 inches proud of a small cut stone drip ledge she set at the top. She framed the lean-to roof from smaller cottonwood poles with a steep 35-degree pitch so snow would slide off rather than accumulate, and she roofed it with overlapping sheets of bark she'd peeled from deadfall elm, weighted with stone. The floor of the lean-to was the critical thing. She didn't pour it or pack it. Instead, she laid 2 courses of flat limestone on the bare earth, creating a raised floor surface about 7 inches above the ground level, 7 inches of air between the bottom of the stacked wood and the earth. Water that entered through the ventilation gaps during rain would flow down across the slope of the floor she'd built. She'd set the stones with a deliberate 1-inch fall per foot toward the open front and drain away before it could touch the bottom course of the woodpile. She cut, split, and stacked all 6 cords herself over the course of September and the first 2 weeks of October. By the time the first real frost came in late October 1874, her woodpile was stacked dry and tight under the lean-to roof, off the ground, ventilated, protected from direct weather. She was ready. And now, right now, before we get to what January 14th looked like from inside that cabin, I want you to think about joining this community. We are genuinely trying to document the practical knowledge of the American frontier before it disappears entirely. These aren't just stories. They are field-tested solutions to problems that took years of suffering to solve, and Nora Brandt solved one that hundreds of families before her had simply endured. If you want to be part of preserving that, subscribe right now and ring the bell. Every new subscriber tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and that helps us keep the lights on. Now, back to Kansas, back to January, because it's about to get cold. The first person to openly mock Nora Brandt's woodshed was a man named August Fenner. Fenner was 39, a former private in the 3rd Kansas Cavalry who'd served under General Blunt during the war and had decided, like a lot of men who came home from that conflict, that he'd rather deal with the indifferent cruelty of the land than anything that required him to take orders from another human being again. He'd built a competent soddy on the eastern edge of the valley, kept 2 draft horses and a small kitchen garden, and supplemented his income in winter by cutting and selling firewood to the few families who weren't managing to keep up their own supply. He was not a mean man, but he was a man who'd seen a great deal and thought he'd seen most of what there was to see. And when he rode past Nora's property in early November and saw the lean-to woodshed, he pulled up his horse and started to laugh. "Girl," he called out, and Nora, who was mending a crack in the clay pointing of her west wall, looked up. "What is that thing?" she told him. He kept laughing. "You built a barn for your firewood. I built a shelter for my firewood." "Wood doesn't need a shelter," he said. "Wood needs to be split and stacked. I got 8 cords sitting in the open air right now, and it'll burn fine all winter." "You'll see," she said, and went back to her wall. Fenner rode away, still shaking his head. He'd tell the story at the Tressler place that afternoon. Had she see that crazy Brandt girl's woodshed? And Walt Tressler would listen and not say much, the way Tressler didn't say much about things he was still working out. Harriet Voss, hearing it secondhand 2 days later, would simply purse her lips and file it away. The fourth skeptic, the one who would cause Nora the most actual trouble before the winter was over, was Reverend Silas Peck. Reverend Peck ran a small congregation out of a converted soddy at the east end of the valley. 13 families who gathered on Sunday mornings to hear him preach from Proverbs and James. He was not a fool. He was, in fact, a reasonably educated man for that country, having attended a Methodist seminary in Ohio before deciding that the frontier was where God needed him more. But he had a particular way of reading the world that sorted everything into the practical and the prideful, and Nora's elaborate preparations struck him increasingly as belonging to the second category. He came to call on her in early December under the pretext of pastoral concern and found her finishing the lime wash of her interior walls. "I'm told you've made quite extensive preparations," he said, standing in the doorway of her cabin. He would not come in. It wouldn't have been proper, a young woman alone. Looking at the whitened walls, the small iron stove with its carefully chinked clay collar around the flue hole, the heavy burlap curtain she'd hung over the window opening and door frame as a second layer of insulation. "You've put considerable labor into this." "I have," she said. "The Lord provides for those who trust in Him," Peck said. It wasn't a threat. It was genuinely what he believed, and he was genuinely, in his way, concerned for her. I wonder if all this preparation is a form of anxiety rather than faith. Nora Brandt set down her whitewash brush and looked at Reverend Peck for a moment. She was not a disrespectful girl. Her father had raised her to be thoughtful and measured. But there was something in her that had been ground down to a certain hardness by the year she'd had. And it came through in her voice when she answered, "My father trusted in the Lord and prepared his woodshed before every winter. she said. "I don't think God minds if you stack your firewood right." Peck had the grace to look slightly abashed. He told her she was welcome at Sunday services whenever she wished to come. He rode home with the nagging sense that the girl had made some point he hadn't fully accounted for, though he couldn't have said precisely what it was. December passed without incident. The weather in December 1874 was deceptive, milder than usual, with daytime temperatures reaching the mid-40s on several occasions, and only one real snowfall before Christmas, a light 2-inch dusting that melted within a day. The settlers in the Crosswind Valley counted themselves lucky. August Fenner's open-air woodpile sat under its canvas tarp and looked fine. Walt Tressler's pile, stacked neatly against the south wall of his soddy, looked fine. The Kowalczyk family's wood, 11 families sharing a loose cooperative understanding, helping each other through the hard times, looked fine. Nora spent December mostly alone. She was not invited to join the cooperative, partly because she was 16 and female and had no male head of household to speak for her interest, and partly because the other settlers weren't sure yet what to make of her. Harriet Voss came by once with a pair of woolen socks she'd knitted and stayed for an hour, drinking the bitter chicory coffee that was all Nora had, looking at the cabin walls and at the woodshed with an expression that was becoming, gradually, more respectful and less doubtful. "Your floor in there," Harriet said, nodding at the lean-to through the open cabin door. "How high'd you raise it?" 7 inches, Nora said. "I've seen wood go rotten sitting on dirt," Harriet said. "My first year lost 1/3 of a cord that way. Never thought to lift it. My father said wood needs air underneath same as it needs air above." Harriet looked at the woodpile for a long moment. "You know what kills the wood in a pile?" she said. "The moisture," Nora said. "The ground's always damp, even when it looks dry." "Wicks up into the bottom course," Harriet agreed. "Then it moves up from there. Top stays dry because the rain runs off. Bottom rots because the earth never really dries." She paused. 7 inches. 7 inches of nothing," Nora said. "But it's the right nothing." Harriet Voss laughed. It was the first time Nora had heard her laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine and quick, like something she didn't do often but meant when she did. January came, and with it, January 14th. The morning of January 14th, 1875, began at 34 degrees Fahrenheit and cloudy, which was cold but manageable by Kansas standards. There was no wind until about 2 in the afternoon, when a steady northwest breeze started up. The settlers read it as a weather change coming. Everyone on the plains learned to read wind shifts the way sailors read water, but it didn't feel like a crisis. The Kowalczyk family, Piotr and Marta and their 4 children, had about 1.5 cords of wood left in their pile, which they figured would last them through the month if they were careful. The temperature at 2 in the afternoon was 31 degrees. By 4, it was 19 degrees and the wind was coming hard out of the north at something close to 40 miles an hour. By 6, it was 4 degrees and the wind chill was pushing far below zero, colder than most of the people in that valley had felt in their lives outside of a few nights in the deep Dakota winters that some of the earlier settlers had known. The Blue Norther, that's what they called these events, a front that came down out of Canada like a wall, dropping temperatures faster than a man could believe without feeling it, was one of the most severe in 10 years of Kansas settlement. Inside the Kowalczyk soddy, Piotr went to the woodpile at dusk and found a problem. The top 2/3 of the woodpile was frozen. Not just cold, frozen. The light December snowfall had left moisture on the exposed top sections of the pile, and that moisture had soaked down into the wood during the brief warm spell in late December when the temperatures had risen above freezing for 4 days running. When the cold snapped back, the moisture in the wood had frozen into ice. Wood with that much ice in it, internal ice, trapped between the fibers, would not light easily. It would steam and hiss and burn reluctant, and it would produce far less heat per pound than dry wood, because a significant portion of the combustion energy would go toward driving off the moisture first. Piotr Kowalczyk worked on that woodpile for 40 minutes in a wind that was now cutting at -10 degrees Fahrenheit equivalent, trying to find pieces that had stayed dry. He found some in the middle of the pile where the canvas had held better. He found almost none in the bottom 2 courses, which had been sitting on frozen ground and had wicked moisture up steadily through the fall. By the time he brought his arms full inside and got the stove burning, it was 7 in the evening, and it had taken him half an hour to get a fire going, burning through 5 times the wood he'd normally use just to nurse wet logs to something like combustion. By midnight, his woodpile was down to a quarter cord, all of it borderline wet. At 2 in the morning, Marta Kowalczyk bundled her youngest, a boy of 3 named Józef, in every blanket she had and held him against her body while Piotr went outside with an axe. He had 3 rounds of fresh-cut timber he hadn't gotten around to splitting. Elm, 18 inches through, frozen solid. He split for 40 minutes. He brought the split wood in. It steamed. It barely burned. The Saudi temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit inside, which was survivable but not safe for the sick boy, who had a chest cough already, or for the infant Marta hadn't told anyone about yet, the one she was carrying 4 months in. The Fenner family ran into the same problem an hour later. August Fenner's 8 cords of open-air wood, the pile he'd laughed about sheltering, had 2 exposed faces, one to the north, one to the west, both of which had been hit hard by blowing snow all evening. The bottom course was sitting on earth that had thawed and refrozen 3 times in December, and the moisture content of those logs was something close to 40%. He got his stove running on a middle section cord that was reasonably dry, but he burned through it fast because cold, dense air in a Saudi pulls heat out faster than most people account for, and by 3 in the morning he was calculating whether he could make it to Tressler's place in this wind. He couldn't. Nobody was riding anywhere in -18-degree temperatures with a 40-mile-an-hour wind. You'd be dead before you went a mile. What you could do, if you were desperate enough, was walk a quarter mile. Nora heard the knock at her door at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning. She'd been awake. She almost always woke once in the night to check the stove in hard weather, and this was the hardest weather she'd seen in her life, but her cabin was holding. It was 49 degrees Fahrenheit inside, which was cold but nowhere near dangerous. The thick limestone walls had been absorbing heat from the stove since late afternoon, and they were radiating it back steadily, the way stone does, the way her father had told her it would. The stove was burning at its lowest comfortable setting, and she had touched wood 5 times in 8 hours. She had wood to spare. She opened the door, and Piotr Kowalczyk was standing in the darkness with a child on his back. Behind him, 30 feet back in the blowing dark, his wife and 3 other children were huddled together. Nora stepped back and opened the door wide. She had a cabin that was 14 feet by 16. She had a stove that was still burning well. She had dry firewood in the lean-to that was dry because it was sitting 7 inches off the ground on raised stone with 4 inches of air circulating through the ventilation gaps in the limestone outer wall. Wood that had gone in dry in October and stayed dry through 3 months of freeze and thaw because the lean-to had done exactly what she'd built it to do. She moved the stove to the center of the room. She put the Kowalczyk children close to it. Marta Kowalczyk sat down in the single chair Nora owned, and her face crumpled with relief and exhaustion and something close to shame. Piotr Kowalczyk stood by the stove and looked at the walls of the cabin. Really looked at them, the way a man looks at something that has surprised him. And then he looked at Nora. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your wood is dry." "Yes," she said. "All of it?" "All of it." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, very simply, "Dziękuję. Thank you." His voice was rough with cold and with something more than cold. "There's chicory on the stove," she said. "It's not coffee, but it's hot." At 6 in the morning, August Fenner came. He came on foot, which told Nora exactly how bad it was outside. Fenner loved his horses, and he would not risk them in the cold unless he had no choice, which meant he'd already decided a horse couldn't make it in this wind. He was wearing every piece of clothing he owned, stacked in layers, and his beard had ice in it, and his eyelashes were frosted white. And when Nora opened the door, he looked past her at the cabin full of people, and then at the wood stove burning steady and low and warm, and he stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, Miss Brandt." Nora Brandt was 16 years old, and she had every right to say any number of things in that moment. She could have said she'd told him so. She could have let him stand in the cold a moment longer than was necessary. She was not made that way. She stepped back and said, "Come in and get warm," and that was the end of it. The cabin held 7 people through the rest of that night and into the morning. Nora made 3 trips to the lean-to for wood. 3 trips in 24 hours, each time coming back with dry, split elm and cottonwood that caught on the first strike of the flint, and burned steady and hot and long. The Kowalczyk boys' cough improved as the hours passed and the air inside the cabin stayed warm. Marta said nothing about her pregnancy, but she ate the dried venison and corn porridge that Nora produced from her stores without any of the nausea she'd been feeling for weeks. By 9 in the morning, the temperature outside was still -14 Fahrenheit. Inside Nora Brandt's limestone cabin, it was 52 degrees and rising. The norther broke on the afternoon of January 15th, the way those fronts do, suddenly, dramatically, with the wind dropping from 40 miles an hour to nearly nothing in the space of 20 minutes, and the temperature beginning its slow recovery. By January 17th, it was back up to 28 degrees in the daytime, which felt almost warm to people who'd just survived what they'd survived. Walt Tressler came to see Nora Brandt on January 18th. He came with his wife Dorothea, a sturdy German-born woman of 44, who looked at the cabin and the woodshed with an expression of frank, uncomplicated respect. Tressler himself walked the lean-to twice, stopping to examine the raised limestone floor, the ventilation gaps, the angle of the roof, the way the drip ledge was keeping rain and snowmelt from entering through the gaps. He picked up a piece of wood from the bottom course of the pile and turned it in his hands. He knocked it against another piece. The sound was dry and solid, the sound of wood that had been protected. 7-inch clearance, he said. 7 inches, Nora confirmed. He set the piece of wood down carefully, almost respectfully. "I've been stacking wood on this plains for 6 years, he said. "Lost the bottom course every year. Just figured that was the way of things." He shook his head. "It ain't." Dorothea Tressler put a hand on Nora's arm and squeezed once. Then she looked at the cabin walls and asked how much clay Nora had used in the joints. And for the next 2 hours, in the cold January sunshine of western Kansas, 4 people stood around a 16-year-old girl's woodshed and talked about what she'd figured out and how she'd figured it out, and what it meant for every other homestead on those plains. Harriet Voss came on January 20th. She walked around the lean-to 3 times without saying anything, the same way she'd done with the cabin walls in August. Then she said, "How much did it cost you to build this?" Nora thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "Everything I used came off the property." Harriet looked at the ventilation gaps. "The gaps," she said. "You sized those deliberately." 4 inches wide, 6 tall, Nora said. "Wide enough to let air circulate, narrow enough that a hard-blowing snow can't drive straight through. The ledge above deflects it." "How'd you know to put the ledge there?" "The way rain hits a windowsill," Nora said. "If the sill has an overhang, the water hits the overhang and drips clear of the wall. I just put the same thing over the gaps." Harriet Voss was quiet for a moment. The wind was light today, the Kansas plains temporarily at peace. A meadowlark was singing somewhere to the south. "Your father taught you this?" Harriet asked. "Parts of it," Nora said. "He taught me how wood breathes. I worked out the rest." "He'd be proud," Harriet said. It came out simple and direct, the way Harriet said things, and it hit Nora in a way she didn't entirely expect. She was 16 years old and she'd been kicked off her own family's land by a man she'd never been able to make herself like, and she'd spent 7 months building something from nothing in conditions that would have broken a grown man with twice her experience, and nobody up to this point had said anything to her about pride. She turned away toward the creek for a moment and composed herself, and when she turned back, her expression was steady. "I should have done better by the door insulation," she said. "The burlap lets more cold in than I'd like." Harriet Voss smiled. "Come spring," she said, "we'll work on that." Reverend Peck came last. He came on January 25th, 11 days after the blizzard, and he came with his hat in his hands. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. He stood outside the door of the cabin and told Nora that 3 families in his congregation had come through the norther with reduced hardship, in part because of what August Fenner and Pyotr Kowalczyk had told people about her woodshed. 2 families had managed to bring in their bottom wood courses and prop them on split rounds before the worst of the cold hit, after hearing from Fenner what he'd seen. 1 family had enough saved wood to see them through. "I said something unkind last month," Peck told her. "About your preparations." "You said the Lord provides," Nora said. "I don't take that as unkind." "I implied that careful preparation was a form of worry rather than wisdom," he said. "I was wrong. There's a version of faith that looks like foolishness, and there's a version of preparation that looks like worry, and you can be forgiven for confusing them. I confused them." He paused. "Proverb says, 'A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions.' I should have remembered that before I spoke." Nora Brandt considered this for a moment. She was not a grudge holder by nature. Her father had not raised her to be. "You want to see the woodshed?" she said. Peck did. He stood in the lean-to for a while, looking at the raised floor, at the ventilation gaps, at the roof pitch. Then he asked her if he could bring a man named Gunnar Ostergaard out to see it in the spring. Ostergaard was one of his congregation members who was planning to build a new place later that year. "Bring whoever wants to come," Nora said. By the end of February 1875, Nora Brandt still had 2 cords of dry firewood in her lean-to. 2 cords. Out of 6. She had burned 4 cords through one of the worst Kansas winters on record, and she still had a third of her supply left, dry and solid and ready. Meanwhile, families who'd stored 8 to 10 cords in the open had burned through their supply and were buying wood at ruinous prices from the few stockists who'd thought ahead. August Fenner sold most of his remaining supply and made a profit on it, but even he acknowledged in his direct and plain way that he'd gotten through the winter more by luck than by design. Walt Tressler did the math out loud one afternoon at his kitchen table with Nora and Dorothea and Harriet Voss, the way practical frontier people did when they were working out a new principle. 6 cords against other families' 10 or 12. That was a savings of 4 to 6 cords of labor, cutting, splitting, and hauling. At the prices prevailing in that county in early 1875, that was a savings of between $8 and $14. For a 16-year-old girl running a homestead alone on $11 startup capital, that was not an abstract number. More importantly, and Tressler was careful to say this because he was a man who was honest about being wrong, more importantly, the difference between Nora's wood and everyone else's wood wasn't how much she'd cut. It was how much of what she'd cut was actually usable when she needed it. Wet wood burned at roughly 60 to 65% efficiency compared to dry wood. Split wood that had been sitting on damp ground for 3 months could run 20 to 30% moisture content compared to the 8 to 12% you'd want for good combustion. The difference between burning wood at 65% efficiency and burning wood at full efficiency was the difference between 6 cords and 10 cords. It was a false economy to cut more wood if you weren't going to store it right. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his soddy for a moment. "Everything my father taught me about firewood," he said slowly, "I learned in Illinois, where you stack it in a shed because that's what you have. Out here we don't have sheds. We haven't been building them." He looked at Nora. "Why haven't we been building them?" "Because you can build a shed out of anything," Nora said. "You don't need lumber. You don't need a lot of anything. You need stone and poles and a roof that sheds rain." Tressler nodded. "We've been thinking of a woodshed as something a man builds after he's settled," he said. "Something you build when you have time and material for an extra structure." "You're saying it's not extra. You're saying it's the same priority as the house itself." "You have a house to keep warm," Nora said. "You need the wood dry to do it. How is the house higher priority than the thing that keeps the house running?" Nobody had a good answer to that. The following autumn, 7 of the 13 families in Reverend Peck's congregation built covered woodsheds. 5 of them used variations on Nora's raised limestone floor design. 2 used a simpler version, split logs laid across flat stones. Same principle, different materials. All of them reported in the winter of 1875-76 that they'd burned less wood than in previous years and maintained more consistent temperature in their homes. August Fenner built the most elaborate version of all. He used his considerable strength to quarry stone for a proper 3-sided lean-to off his soddy's north wall, exactly as Nora had done, with the same raised floor and the same ventilation gap principle, and he added one improvement of his own, a small hinged hatch at the front of the lean-to, made from cottonwood board, that he could open or close depending on the humidity. When the air was very damp, during the brief Kansas thaws when moisture seemed to come from every direction at once, he closed the hatches. When the weather was clear and cold, he opened them. The wood behind those hatches, he would tell anyone who asked, was the driest firewood he'd ever split, drier than anything he'd stored in Ohio or anywhere else. He told Nora about the hatch improvement in the spring of 1876. when he rode over to ask about something else entirely and ended up staying for 2 hours. "The hatch is good," she said. She was 20 by then, and her voice had a different quality, still direct, still measured, but with the easy confidence of someone who'd stopped being surprised that her own ideas worked. "Humidity control is the last piece. Most people don't think about it." "Most people don't think about much of this," Fenner said. "They think about it every time they can't light their fire," she said. "They just don't think about it in July, when there's still time to do something." Fenner was quiet for a moment. "You think about things in July that most people only think about in January," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, or maybe it was. It was an observation, accurate and plainly delivered. "My father did," she said. "He said the only problems you can actually solve are the ones you think about before they're problems." The limestone cabin that Nora Brandt built in the summer of 1874 is gone now, of course. Everything on the Kansas High Plains has been built and rebuilt and built again, and the particular quarter section on the north side of the Crosswind Valley has had a dozen different owners since the Homestead Act era, and nothing of what she put there survives in any physical sense. But the records do. The Haskell County Historical Society has her land claim paperwork, filed in July 1874 in the name of Nora Brandt, age 16, occupation farmer. The land agent's notation, in Ira Dobbins' careful hand, says, "Applicant presented alone. No male household present. Act reviewed and found applicable. Claim approved." That's the whole of the official record. 16 years old, alone, act reviewed and found applicable. But the knowledge she preserved, the raised floor, the ventilation gap, the drip ledge, the lean-to attached to the north wall, wasn't hers in the sense that she invented it from nothing. She assembled it from pieces, her father's woodcutter's knowledge, the building logic of the German hill country, the observable physics of moisture and drainage and airflow that anyone could see if they looked long enough. What she contributed was the assembly. The decision to look at what everyone was doing and ask, with genuine curiosity and no reverence for the conventional way, why it was being done that way and whether there was a better approach. Modern studies of firewood storage have confirmed every element of her design. A 2008 analysis by the USDA Forest Service on residential firewood management found that raised storage, wood placed at minimum 6 inches above ground on a permeable base, reduced moisture content in bottom course logs by between 18 and 24% compared to ground-level storage. A 6-inch air gap underneath the pile reduced fungal decay rates by 30% in humid climates. Ventilated sidewalls with controlled openings combined with a waterproof roof produced the ideal combination of airflow and precipitation protection. Adequate evaporation of internal moisture without reintroduction of external moisture through rain or blowing snow. 8 inches of roof overhang, which is essentially what Nora's drip ledge created, was the threshold at which rain splashback onto the lower wood courses dropped to negligible levels. She got all of this right. She got all of this right in 1874, with no formal education in physics or construction, working from observation and from the lessons her father had given her, at 16 years old, alone, on a quarter section of Kansas grassland that nobody else had wanted. Walt Tressler, in his old age, told his granddaughter about Nora Brandt. The granddaughter, a woman named Clara Tressler, who lived long enough to speak to a local historian in the 1940s, said that her grandfather had described Nora as the most naturally scientific person he ever met on the frontier, which was saying something because the frontier attracted people who had to think. He said she had the rarest kind of intelligence, not the kind that works from books, though she was a capable reader, but the kind that works from things, that looks at a woodpile and sees a system, that looks at moisture and air and stone and sees a problem with a solution. Harriet Voss lived to be 81 and is buried in a small cemetery outside what is now Johnson City, Kansas. Her obituary in the local paper, printed in 1903, mentions that she was known across the county for her practical improvements to homestead construction, and that she was one of the first women in the region to hold a full Homestead Act claim independently. It does not mention Nora Brandt, but Harriet's niece, in a letter preserved in the County Historical Society's files, wrote that her aunt spoke of a young woman named Brandt, who had shown the county how wood ought to be kept, and that Harriet considered her one of the finest minds she'd met in 40 years of frontier life. August Fenner's improvements to his own woodshed were noted, without attribution, in a pamphlet distributed by the Kansas State Agricultural College in 1879, advising settlers on efficient fuel management. The pamphlet recommended raised floors, ventilated lean-tos, and controlled humidity hatches for firewood storage. It described these features as best practices discovered through the experience of successful Kansas homesteaders. No names were given. That's often how it works. The knowledge spreads, and the person who worked it out gets lost in the spreading. The technique survives. The 16-year-old girl alone on her claim in July heat, thinking about January, goes unnamed. Nora Brandt proved up on her claim in 1879, 5 years to the month after she filed it. She had by that time broken and planted 38 acres, built a small hay barn using an upgraded version of her original woodshed design, and added 2 rooms to the limestone cabin. She had 4 cows, a mule, and a reputation across a 3-county area as the person to ask about stone construction and fuel management. She'd helped 11 families build woodsheds modeled on her own. She'd consulted, without charge and without being asked to charge, on the construction of a root cellar for the Peck family, a storm shelter for the Kowalczyks, and a spring house for a new arrival named Lisbeth Haugen, who'd come up from Oklahoma Territory and didn't know yet what a Kansas winter felt like. She married at 23, a man named Thomas Carver, a quiet and steady Kentuckian who'd come west after the war and had the good sense to recognize when he met Nora Brandt that he was looking at someone he'd be learning from for the rest of his life. He was right about that. They had 4 children and farmed the quarter section together until the drought of 1888, when they moved 40 miles east to better water and started over, which was a thing frontier people did with a frequency that would astonish us today. Whether Nora's woodshed survived the move is not recorded. What survived was the knowledge, the specific, tested, practical knowledge of what a raised floor and a ventilation gap and a drip ledge can do for a stack of firewood in a Kansas winter. What survived was the principle. Think about the problem before you have the problem. Build the solution in July. Don't wait for January to tell you what you didn't know. There's something that stays with you about Nora Brandt if you sit with her story long enough. It isn't the woodshed, though the woodshed is remarkable. It isn't even the cabin, though building a limestone structure alone at 16 and 100-degree July heat is the kind of thing that makes you quietly recalibrate what you think human beings are capable of. What stays with you is the particular quality of mind that let her see what nobody else was seeing. Everybody on those plains had the same problem every winter. Everybody had wet wood at the bottom of their pile. Everybody had mornings where the fire wouldn't light, and the cold was coming through the walls, and the family was breathing out clouds of frost. It wasn't a hidden problem. It was one of the most visible, most universal, most complained about problems on the Kansas frontier. And yet nobody had solved it in any systematic way, because the solution required you to think about the problem as a system, to ask not just, why is this wood wet, but what is the process by which it gets wet? And at what point in that process can I intervene? Nora's father gave her the vocabulary for that kind of thinking. The wood breathes, he told her. It takes on moisture from whatever touches it. Air it from below. Protect it from above. Give it what it needs to stay dry rather than trying to dry it out after it's gotten wet. Give it what it needs to stay dry. That's not a complicated principle. It's not a novel one. The woodcutters of Württemberg knew it. The timber framers of Norway knew it. The barn builders of the American Southeast knew it in a different form. What Nora Brandt did was apply it to a specific problem on a specific frontier at a specific moment, alone, at 16 years old, with $11 and a hatchet, and her father's voice in her head telling her how wood worked. And 3 families stayed warm through a killing blizzard that stopped the whole county cold. And a man who had laughed at her woodshed walked a quarter mile through minus 18-degree wind to stand at her door and ask to come in. And a reverend who had implied that preparation was a form of worry stood in a lean-to in January sunshine and said simply that he had been wrong. That's the thing about practical knowledge, honestly applied. It doesn't argue, it doesn't need to. It just stays dry when everything else is wet. It burns clean and hot when the cold is pushing through the walls, and it keeps the people inside alive, and eventually even the skeptics come around, not because you convinced them, but because the world did. If you've made it this far with us tonight, And I think most of you have, because this is exactly the kind of story this community exists for. Then you already understand why we keep doing this. The practical wisdom of the frontier didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because nobody wrote it down, and the people who knew it died, and their children moved to cities where the knowledge didn't seem to matter anymore. But it does matter. Not because you're planning to build a limestone cabin in Kansas, though stranger things have happened, but because the quality of mind behind it matters. The habit of looking at a problem before it's a problem. The willingness to think from first principles instead of from convention. The understanding that the most important preparation you can do is the kind you do in the good weather when you still have time to do it right. Nora Brandt had $11 and a hatchet, and she kept 6 families warm through the worst blizzard in a decade. What she really had was a way of thinking. Subscribe to this channel right now and help us keep documenting what people like her figured out. There are hundreds of these stories, thousands, sitting in county historical societies and family letters and old agricultural pamphlets. And every year more of them are lost forever. You joining this community is a vote for preserving them. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell someone else about this channel if it means something to you. These voices deserve to be heard. Let's keep them alive. Think in July. Stay warm in January. We'll see you next time.